Okay, a second video for week 4, Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s. Now, a few generalities about the movement, then we're going to get to some background. The methods of the movement: civil disobedience, peaceful resistance. This was the key for King, of course, leading peaceful resistance. Uh, and this, of course, goes back, you go back to Henry David Thoreau, um, King, of course, Gandhi. There's a lot of this throughout history. But for King, what the civil disobedience, what it provided really was um, a way to demonstrate really the moral high ground of the movement. With peaceful resistance, when you're getting physically attacked, but you do not fight back that way, you show people how serious you are, how committed you are. And again, it gives you kind of the moral high ground. That's kind of oversimplifying it, but at least gives you an idea. Of course, civil rights movement would use marches, boycotts, sit-ins, among many other things. We'll provide some examples later. What was the movement about? Most in its most basic level, legalized equality. This would lead to economic, social, political opportunity. Uh, Equality meaning, again, this initial equality, not necessarily a mandated equality, you must pay us, or, well, that's kind of, it's about opportunity. Equality of opportunity, not necessarily equality of outcome. Equality of outcome, of course, is forced. It's about dictatorial leadership, really. But what African Americans sought was, again, equality of opportunity. We simply want the same opportunity everybody else has. We want to be treated the same. We want to have that legal equality in front of the law, politically, again, socially, culturally, etc. All these things kind of emanate from the basics of legalized equality. Now, the background, we go back as far as Reconstruction after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th, of course, ended slavery. The 14th established citizenship and equal protection in front of the law, uh, defined citizenship, and defined African Americans born in the United States as citizens. The 15th gave African Americans the right to vote. Officially, then, African Americans were provided these basic rights, this legalized equality. In reality, though, they are treated as second class citizens due to the end of Reconstruction, the Compromise of 1877. Uh, the North removes itself from the South, and Southern states are again allowed to direct their own realities. They are allowed to establish pre Civil War political, social, economic, and cultural institutions. And by doing so, they are able to find ways then to minimize equality, to still treat African Americans as second class citizens. Politically, we see this with restrictions on voting. Even though African Americans were given the right to vote, they were still denied the right to vote. Southern states got around the wording of the amendment, which said that you cannot discriminate based on race. Well, what they did was they established poll taxes, literacy tests, similar things. You had to pay a tax or you had to pass a test to be able to take a vote. Of course, poor whites often could not do these things either, but that's where we get the grandfather clause. If your grandfather voted in an election, you could vote in an election as well. Obviously, this meant no African Americans would be able to vote based on that reality, whereas poor whites could. We see Jim Crow laws, segregation of public facilities. This would be codified really in Plessy versus Ferguson, an 1896 Supreme Court decision, which essentially legalized segregation and the idea of separate but equal. Separate facilities for black and white were fine as long as they were equal. Again, the equality part of this is very much fuzzy. It wasn't equal, but again, the way that it was posed made it appear so. So The establishment of Jim Crow laws meant that folks dined at separate restaurants. They used different swimming pools, water fountains, schools, etc. There was certainly dissent, of course. African Americans did not sit idly by and allow for this treatment passively. New civil rights leaders and organizations would emerge at this time and going forward. Again, we're at the end of the 19th century here. Ida Wells formed her anti-lynching movement to try to stop that violence. She attempted to make it a federal crime, thereby going over the heads of local state authorities. She had some support, but ultimately there was no federal anti-lynching measure until the 1930s. She also published a newspaper entitled Free Speech in Memphis until it was burned to the ground and she was run out of town. Booker T. Washington was an educator at the Tuskegee Institute. He preached patience and accommodation, of working within the system, of learning vocational skills and economic understanding. Equality would be a slow, gradual struggle. Key to this was the idea of economic self-sufficiency, economic independence. Strangely enough, this kind of dovetails with what Marcus Garvey will talk about. We're going to get to him in a minute. Washington communicated his vision in an 1895 speech entitled The Atlantic Compromise. Make no mistake, he felt African Americans were equal and could do whatever was necessary. He simply took a more cautious approach. His famous line, quote, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." Whites loved him at the time. They would help finance his institute because, again, he was somewhat accepting of the accommodationism or the idea of slow change, gradualism. But he did believe African Americans were equal to whites, and he did work aggressively to find civil rights. And again, many of his ideas were actually embraced by others who were considered quite a bit more radical. Now, at the time, of course, his foil was essentially W.E.B. Du Bois, quite a bit more aggressive, also spoke to a different demographic. Whereas Washington focused on vocation and the average African American, Du Bois was more of an intellectual. He sought more of a focus on what he called the talented tenth, the most educated, well-off African Americans. And these people would immediately push for inclusion into all aspects of American life. And again, it was up to this leadership. This is very much an elitism that Du Bois favored, but again, he believed that this group would lead African Americans to true change. He criticized Washington for his accommodationism, whereas Washington looked to the average African American to help gradually lead the change. Again, Du Bois focused on writers, artists, intellectuals, etc. He led what was called the Niagara Movement. Initially, this was a meeting of leading African Americans in Niagara Falls, Ontario, because they could not find a place in the United States to meet. This culminated in the creation of the NAACP, which we will get to here in a minute. His most famous work was Souls of Black Folk, a group of essays that reflected the belief African Americans were equal, and it very much celebrated African American culture and social mores. It was also, his doctoral work was Black Reconstruction, which emphasized the role of African Americans during Reconstruction. This was a revolutionary book, and it changed the way the Civil War and Reconstruction would be studied going forward. During the 1920s, yet another leader would emerge, Marcus Garvey. Now, his was a complex movement, but it focused on the basic premise of return to Africa. He sought economic self-sufficiency for African Americans. He emphasized racial and cultural pride and outwardly criticized the white power structure. He was not an accommodationist, and indeed he was more aggressive than Du Bois. And Du Bois would criticize Garvey. Garvey, again, was a little bit radical. And for Du Bois, of course, Garvey was destroying all that he, Washington, and others had worked for, which was legalized equality, which was integration into American society. Again, Garvey looked for exclusion. He looked for African Americans to create their own society, their own economy, their own reality. This was, again, antithetical to the civil rights movement in the United States for most of its existence. He would gain many adherents. One reason I believe it's necessary to mention him here is he would be a major influence on the Black Power movement of the 1960s, which we'll get to in a few weeks. Many of their themes came from Garveyism and his focus on African culture. Now, previously, I briefly discussed World War II, and it provided a watershed of sorts for the civil rights movement as well. I've talked about Truman, his civil rights efforts, a bit over the past couple weeks. He was the first president to take an aggressive stance regarding civil rights. The war itself provided new experiences. African Americans fought with whites, the latter realizing maybe differences between the two weren't so stark. African Americans also met up with Europeans who asked them why they were fighting for democracy abroad when they did not even enjoy it at home. This would lead to the Double V campaign, the first major effort of the civil rights movement during this era. Of course, the Double V, double victory, fight for victory at home, and fight for victory abroad. Now, for week 2, we were going to discuss the essay, We Lives in a Free House Such as It Is, and this is still linked on Blackboard. It will take you to the article in the Bellevue Library. Please give it a read if you can. One of the reasons I find this essay so good is that it focuses on civil rights efforts prior to and during World War II. The author emphasizes that the movement may have really begun to take off in the 1950s, but its foundation came earlier. Even this immediate civil rights movement of the mid 20th century, the foundation came prior to and during World War II. An important recognition and change well before Brown versus Board of Education. Again, if you get a chance, please read this. I think it provides a whole new context for the civil rights movement for many of us. Now, I had mentioned the NAACP and Du Bois and his involvement in creating it. What role did this play in the civil rights movement? The NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was the legal wing of the movement, and it sought change through the courts. Again, this is how Du Bois sought change, not just through economic self-sufficiency, but through action promoting legality. 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education. The NAACP sued public schools in the South for violating the separate but equal clause, saying that, in fact, the conditions were not equal. And this was led by Thurgood Marshall. Why is Marshall notable? He would be the first African American on the Supreme Court. Now, what was this truly about? Schools for African Americans were underfunded. Teachers at white schools were paid better. They were given better working conditions, more supplies, better supplies to work with. States spent 10 to 20 times its money on education for whites rather than blacks. So again, 10 to 20 times more on education for white schools than black schools. Brown would overturn Plessy. Chief Justice Earl Warren, who of course led the Warren Court, which was quite influential for making significant change in the middle part of the century. Warren worked to gain a 9-0 unanimous decision on this case because he wanted to avoid any potential claims for legal argument against integration. Separate facilities are inherently unequal, he proclaimed, and this violated the 14th Amendment. Notable about this, another reason why Brown versus Board of Education, this was in Topeka. This was not in the Deep South. This was in Kansas, in the middle of the country. So by focusing on this school system, they were saying, look, we're not talking about just what's going on in the Deep South. This is in the middle of America. This is what represents America, we believe. We have to end this. Still nothing on Jim Crow laws at this point. Southern schools would indeed be quite slow to integrate. By 1964, still fewer than 10% were fully integrated. A year later, we have the Emmett Till situation, if you're familiar with him. Till was a young Chicago gentleman who went down south for the summer to spend time with his family. He watched an attractive white woman in a store, followed her around. His relatives begged him not to. They told him things were different in the South. He paid them no mind. He whistled at her. He was then taken from the place where he was staying and murdered in the middle of the night. White men went on trial for this murder. Mose Wright, who was his grandfather, one of the true heroes of the civil rights movement. Not many people are familiar with him, but he was one of the bravest men, standing up in a courtroom in a small southern town and pointing at the white men who had taken Emmett Till from his house. It didn't matter. The jury came back with not guilty verdicts for everyone, which is, of course, standard. That was the unfortunate truth, because who was sitting on the juries? Mostly white people, and they were associated with the people who would perform these actions. But again, there is an image of Mose Wright, or there are many images on the internet, but you can find one where he's standing up in court pointing at these white men, and you think about the bravery that he showed by being willing to do that. 1955 through 56, of course, we had the famous Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks sat down in the first row of the colored section of the city bus, but as more people got on the bus, whites needed more space. In such an instance, African Americans were required to move to the back of the bus to allow whites to sit. Even though there's this section for African Americans, That is then obviated if enough whites are on the bus. Of course, we know she would not move. Bus driver James Blake would ask her to move. She refused. Are you going to stand up? No, she replied. Well, I'm going to have you arrested. She said, you may do that. Parks was arrested. She was fined $10. Why was this so important? This was essentially the kickoff of the civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance to social injustice strain of the civil rights movement. This also led to the rise in popularity of a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. His associate, Ralph Abernathy, also comes to the fore, and they would create what was known as the Montgomery Improvement Association. Montgomery officials tried everything they could to end it. They arrested both King and Abernathy. 4 churches were bombed. Even the homes of King and Abernathy were bombed. But what made this so successful? People worked together. 99% of African Americans simply refused to ride the buses. They walked to work. They rode bikes. They carpooled. They did whatever they could. People would even just drive up on the street, see an African American walking, stop, open the door. Where do you need to go? And they would give them a ride. The bus company would lose thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, truly. November 23rd, 1956, the United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Montgomery Improvement Association and that segregated busing was declared unconstitutional. King and Abernathy would go on to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as SCLC, to continue work on the civil rights movement. They would fight Jim Crow laws. They relied on peaceful demonstrations. Now, one more thing before we get to Little Rock. As far as Rosa Parks is concerned, this was not her first foray into civil rights activism. It would not be her last. She is known for this, but indeed she was a very active and aggressive woman when it came to such issues. Little Rock, 1957, September 3rd, 9 African American students attempt to attend all-white Central High School. This group, of course, has become known as the Little Rock Nine. Governor Orville Faubus, love that name, mobilized the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the students from entering the school. A federal judge declared the action illegal. The governor would remove the troops. 3 weeks later, September 24th, they try to enter again. They would be taken into the school through the back door. Locals stormed the school grounds, incensed at the fact that African Americans were allowed into their white school. Eisenhower was finally forced to act as this played out on national television. More on that in a minute. Eisenhower would send federal troops into Little Rock. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard so that they were not under the governor's control, and students eventually did go back to school under armed supervision. How would Little Rock react to this? They would actually close their schools in 1958 to prevent integration. They would reopen in 1959, but it goes to show the extent that some would go to prevent integration between the races. One last thing here. I mentioned national television. This is key, and we're going to see it with the Birmingham campaign in the 1960s as well. When you have a movement, when you have an issue, you need publicity. No one cares if the issue is not put right in front of their face. Television was especially crucial to this in the 1950s and then in the 1960s. It was crucial to the civil rights movement. I point out, I often do this, when you look back to the lead up to the Civil War. Harriet Beecher Stowe's publication, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was read by millions across the world. It was the most popular book in England the year that it came out. But the fact remains, what this book did was it made people aware of what was going on with slavery. Many people in the North were not familiar with slavery. They lived in cities. They were young. They were women. They didn't ever interact with slavery. But this book brought the horrors, the brutality of slavery to their fingertips. They could read about it. And this raised consciousness. This cannot be minimized as an impact on the lead up to the Civil War. Lincoln, when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, even supposedly said, quote, "So this is the little woman who started this great big war." She was key to the civil rights, or to the end of slavery, to the abolitionist movement prior to the Civil War. In the 1950s and 1960s, television would similarly play a key role in drumming up publicity. I had mentioned Ralph Ellison as a voice of protest, his work, The Invisible Man. Of course, James Baldwin is another important writer who brought attention to these issues facing Black America in 1950. These voices would only strengthen during the 1960s. We see it not just with political activism, folks like Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, of course, Malcolm X. We see it in social avenues as well, more activism, which we'll get to, Greensboro, the sit ins, etc. You'll see it more as far as economically as well. Again, consider the Black Power movement, the desire for economic self sufficiency. You see it in culture. You see more African American voices come to the fore. Um, in literature, in film, in music. Even many white artists will take up the mantle. Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. Many of Bob Dylan's early records are dotted with issues dealing with civil rights, which we'll get to some of those lyrics down the road. But again, these voices would only strengthen throughout the 1960s and would continue. Think about soul music in the 1970s, and then you think about rap music in the 1980s and 90s. The issues were very much made clear. But this is where we get kind of the foundation of that.